In the 1970s, Canada was generating tens of millions of scrap tires every single year, from the logging routes of the Pacific Northwest to the industrial corridors of southern Ontario. Across the provinces, municipalities and regional districts had no cohesive plan for any of them. Discarded rubber sat piled along rural backroads, caught fire in unmonitored municipal landfills, and turned into stagnant breeding grounds for pests. So when a coalition of civic boosters and coastal development advocates off the southern coast of British Columbia proposed an all-in-one fix, it sounded like an act of pure civic and ecological genius. Their proposal was breathtakingly simple. Take 2 million worn-out vehicle tires and drop them straight into the coastal waters of the Salish Sea. Right alongside vital rocky reefs and delicate marine habitats dotted the coast. This was not a rogue dumping scheme carried out under the cover of night. It was an officially sanctioned, publicly celebrated initiative, vetted by regional authorities, praised by maritime planners, and championed by marine enthusiasts who believed it would supercharge local biodiversity, build up degraded seabed habitats, and bring rockfish, lingcod, and kelp forests flooding back into the area. Today, decades after the grand opening, what technical divers and ocean researchers find resting on the seafloor is the absolute opposite of everything that was promised. This is the story of how public optimism, corporate convenience, and regulatory short-sightedness combined to construct a massive 2 million tire wasteland beneath Canadian waters. To understand why well-educated engineers and provincial bodies thought this was an ecological breakthrough, you have to look at the environmental mindset of the era. For most of the 20th century, Canadian coastal waters and the Great Lakes were treated as limitless industrial disposal zones. From pulp mill effluent poured into ocean inlets to toxic tailings dumped directly into northern waterways, the unwritten rule of industrial growth was simple: out of sight, out of mind. Millions of tons of construction rubble, untreated municipal waste, and toxic runoff routinely went straight into coastal channels. In the mid-20th century, drums of low-level radioactive waste and military surplus were deliberately sunk into deep offshore trenches off both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Against that grim historical backdrop, the idea of submerging clean, solid rubber to engineer marine habitat seemed forward-dash thinking. By the early 1970s, federal and provincial environmental ministries were enacting strict waste regulations, ending routine dumping, and forcing heavy industries to account for their byproducts. That left municipal tire stockpiles stranded with nowhere to go, because modern industrial tire recycling was virtually non-existent. When a newly formed non-profit group stepped forward proposing to clear tire mountains off Crown land and municipal depots to build an artificial reef, everyone from local town halls to federal ocean managers listened. It promised to clear urban blight on land while revitalizing marine ecosystems offshore. The basic biological theory behind artificial reefs was sound. Submerged rocky substrates make up only a fraction of the benthic floor, yet they support an astonishing concentration of marine life. A complex reef functions as an underwater apartment block. In marine ecology, drifting invertebrate larvae and mobile species require firm, stable surfaces to settle, build colonies, and escape predators. Provide solid structural relief, and you give kelp, sponges, and juvenile fish a secure foundation to establish a food web. Sunken vessels and clean granite riprap had succeeded elsewhere in Canadian waters. The fatal flaw was not the ecological concept, but a catastrophic failure of basic materials engineering that no regulator caught in time. When the green light was officially granted in the mid-1970s, the coastal province threw itself into the project with unbridled civic enthusiasm. A flotilla of private pleasure craft, commercial fishing vessels, and tugboats volunteered their decks to haul the cargo out to open water. Across the staging grounds along the docks, volunteers and municipal workers lashed tires into bulky bundles using cheap steel clips and industrial nylon banding, preparing to drop them across dozens of hectares of seabed over a kilometer offshore. The operation turned into a high-profile regional spectacle. Major domestic tire manufacturers and retail distributors rallied around the campaign, framing their logistical sponsorship as a triumph of corporate environmental stewardship and donating commemorative equipment to mark the inaugural drop site. In total, roughly 2 million scrap tires plunged into the cold coastal waters, establishing what promoters proudly christened a revolutionary artificial reef. Picture the scene. Dozens of vessels systematically jettisoning mountains of black rubber into the depths of the channel, while local dignitaries and media crews watched from chartered observation boats. Those standing on the decks genuinely believed they were engineering an ecological sanctuary that would serve generations of maritime life. But beneath the surface, the entire enterprise rested on an elementary material failure that would transform their grand civic achievement into an underwater wrecking ball. The fatal oversight lay in the hardware used to bind the tires together. The project engineers used ordinary, untreated carbon steel clips to secure the heavy bundles. In a harsh marine environment, untreated steel is not a durable structural fastener. It is a rapid chemical countdown. Seawater is a dense electrolyte solution, saturated with dissolved sodium and chloride ions that dramatically accelerate oxidation. The moment dissolved oxygen and salt water make contact with the iron inside the steel, electrons are stripped away at a furious rate. Because corrosion is an electrochemical process, the high salinity and dynamic water movement of northern coastal waters attacked the thin clips without mercy. Within a few short years, the steel oxidized into brittle flakes, structural integrity collapsed, and the bindings snapped throughout the entire formation. Instead of a dense, unified reef, the seabed was suddenly covered by 2 million loose, unanchored rubber projectiles, sitting squarely in the path of ferocious Pacific winter gales and brutal tidal currents. Anyone familiar with the unforgiving power of northern maritime storm surges knows what happened next. When intense seasonal low-pressure systems and bomb cyclones barrel through the coastal straits, powerful deep-water swells lift loose debris off the benthic floor. The 2 million tires were swept up by these bottom currents, transforming into a rolling, grinding avalanche of rubber that barreled across the seafloor. Directly in their path lay delicate, centuries-old natural rocky reefs and ancient glass sponge structures, fragile ecosystems that take hundreds of years to establish and provide essential habitat for lingcod, rockfish, and deep-water invertebrates. The loose tires battered through these habitats with devastating mechanical force, pulverizing living rock, crushing sponge complexes, and grinding decades of natural marine growth into lifeless silt and rubble. An undertaking funded, permitted, and promoted to foster marine abundance became the very instrument systematically tearing it apart. The synthetic reef did not merely fail to create a new ecosystem, it crushed the existing one beneath millions of kilograms of shifting rubber. The environmental devastation could not be contained within the original boundaries of the designated drop zone. As powerful tidal flushes and severe winter storms battered the coast season after season, the unmoored tires were propelled far beyond their starting coordinates. Storm surges flung them across coastal channels and washed them ashore along rugged provincial park coastlines, indigenous treaty lands, and remote stretches of Vancouver Island. Municipalities and regional district managers, who had never been consulted on the original project, suddenly found their maintenance crews hauling waterlogged rubber off public beaches, hundreds of kilometers from the initial coordinates. Compounding this physical destruction was a stark biological reality. An unstable, rolling substrate cannot support marine life. Temperate marine organisms like bull kelp, encrusting coralline algae, and delicate bryozoans require absolute benthic stability to anchor their root systems and holdfasts. A rubber tire that continuously rolls, flips, and drifts across the seafloor with every heavy tide will never host a single viable colony. The project failed on every conceivable metric, wiping out living habitat while leaving a sprawling, barren junkyard across the ocean floor. By the early 2000s, Environmental authorities, marine scientists, and local coastal communities could no longer ignore the undeniable scale of the crisis, and the agonizingly slow work of remediation finally began. This is where the sheer logistical and economic absurdity of the disaster came into sharp focus. The earliest systematic recovery efforts, spearheaded by university marine institutes and funded through modest provincial conservation grants, managed to haul up only around 1,600 tires over months of intensive offshore work. Commercial and research divers had to plunge into frigid, murky waters, manually wrestle each silt-choked, waterlogged casing out of the benthic mud, rig it to surface lines, and hoist it onto recovery barges. When engineers calculated the total bill to scour the entire seabed clean, the estimated financial cost landed somewhere between $50 and $120 million. With municipal and provincial budgets overwhelmed by the projected price tag, progress ground to a near total halt until an unexpected compromise emerged. The Canadian Armed Forces stepped in. The Department of National Defense realized that the sunken wasteland offered an ideal, high-stress training ground for Royal Canadian Navy clearance divers and salvage units. Military personnel turned the disaster zone into a live underwater obstacle course, practicing heavy salvage operations, deep water rigging, and tactical diving by pulling up tens of thousands of tires during routine exercises. Between naval operations and subsequent specialized marine contractors hired by regional authorities, recovery teams managed to extract a few 100,000 tires over the course of more than a decade of dangerous labor. It was a remarkable feat of underwater logistics, until you zoomed out and looked at the baseline numbers. Even after years of relentless physical effort and millions in public spending, well over 1 million tires still sat rotting across the seabed. In recent years, the remediation effort took another unexpected turn when private venture ocean cleanup enterprises entered the picture. These organizations began operating at the site, partially funding their recovery barges, heavy winches, and processing facilities through consumer-facing eco-merchandise, such as wristbands and accessories crafted from salvaged ocean plastics and reclaimed tire rubber. While their removal numbers are genuine and their field crews work under punishing conditions, looking closely at the financial mechanics reveals a profoundly troubling economic picture. Under the initial university research trials, the basic operational cost to recover a single submerged tire averaged roughly $20 to $25. Under the modern commercialized merchandise-funded framework, the effective cost per tire hauled to the surface rises to hundreds of dollars when accounting for marketing overhead, international branding campaigns, and corporate profit margins. Certainly, consumer inflation and modern offshore operating standards account for some of that increase, and private ventures face financial realities that government grants do not. But it introduces an uncomfortable ethical dilemma. Should we celebrate commercial enterprises turning ocean remediation into a lucrative lifestyle brand? Or does commercializing ecological cleanup fundamentally distort environmental responsibility? The most glaring question is what happened to the corporate conglomerates that helped fuel the catastrophe in the first place? The major tire manufacturers that eagerly supplied the scrap piles and proudly celebrated the original deployment have completely vanished from the cleanup manifest. Decades ago, corporate boardrooms were thrilled to divert mountains of unwanted scrap out of overflowing industrial yards and drop them beneath the waves where they vanished from public scrutiny and annual balance sheets. Now, the overwhelming burden of the cleanup falls upon naval divers, university scientists, and public tax dollars, while the original polluters bear zero legal or financial liability. This dynamic points toward a deeply cynical economic reality. When environmental cleanup evolves into a profitable, venture-backed industry, the broader corporate system loses any meaningful incentive to prevent the crisis in the first place. Fixing ecological devastation becomes a revenue generator, quietly creating a framework where pollution is subsidized by the public and remediated for profit. Once you recognize that structural incentive, it becomes impossible to view these corporate-sponsored marine initiatives the same way again. If you believe this synthetic reef disaster was an isolated Canadian miscalculation, look across international waters, where the exact same flawed premise played out with identical consequences. In the 1980s, maritime authorities along the French Mediterranean coast sank roughly 25,000 vehicle tires between Cannes and Antibes, operating under the exact same unexamined assumption that submerged vulcanized rubber was an inert, harmless foundation for underwater biodiversity. By the mid-2000s, European marine ecotoxicologists discovered that those submerged casings were continuously leaching toxic zinc, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and heavy metal compounds directly into the fragile littoral food web. The French government launched an urgent, comprehensive removal campaign, bringing in major corporate tire manufacturers to help shoulder the operational costs. The stinging contrast lies in the execution. European engineering teams managed to extract their submerged tires at a fraction of the cost per unit compared to North American operations, highlighting how administrative competence and corporate accountability dictate environmental outcomes. The pattern of rebranding disposal as ecological stewardship extends into even stranger territory. In coastal waters to the south, commercial ventures developed artificial reefs where cremated human remains are mixed into specialized concrete to create underwater memorial architectures, marketed to grieving families as an eternal contribution to marine biodiversity. While these structures do attract certain species, the luxury pricing, reaching tens of thousands of dollars per placement, and the staggering carbon footprint required for both high-temperature cremation and concrete production undermine the green narrative. It remains an exclusive venture that cloaks high-emission, high-cost practices under the virtuous veneer of environmental restoration. Consider also the deliberate sinking of decommissioned naval warships across North American coastlines, including massive destroyers and supply ships blasted onto the seabed to serve as recreational dive attractions and artificial habitats. Promoters and tourism boards hail these sunken giants as thriving urban centers for rockfish and cold-water flora. Yet many of these vintage vessels went down into provincial and state waters containing residual toxic hydrocarbons, heavy lead coatings, and hazardous electrical insulation that take decades to remediate safely. This reveals the recurring pattern running beneath modern industrial culture. Whenever society is confronted with an unmanageable mountain of expensive, complex waste, whether millions of unrecyclable scrap tires, millions of tons of contaminated industrial demolition rubble, or obsolete naval steel, it is far cheaper and politically expedient to rebrand mass dumping as habitat creation. When an artificial reef appears to hold, politicians and corporate sponsors celebrate their vision and pocket the massive disposal savings. When the project collapses into an ecological catastrophe, the original proponents have long since retired, leaving the public purse to manage the fallout. The open ocean serves as the ultimate corporate escape hatch, because the evidence sinks beneath the surface, far beyond the everyday view of the public dot. Today, contemporary marine biologists and researchers at Fisheries and Oceans Canada are increasingly skeptical of broad artificial reef claims. Rigorous ecological surveys demonstrate that artificial reefs rarely increase overall biomass or produce net new populations of fish. Rather, they act as mechanical aggregation points, drawing existing schools of rockfish, cod, and lingcod away from natural rocky pinnacles into dense, accessible clusters where commercial and sport anglers can harvest them with devastating efficiency. The project that began 50 years ago, with optimistic volunteer flotillas on a sunny coastal afternoon, became a multi-decade crisis due to a handful of ungalvanized metal fasteners. Yet the definitive lesson of the disaster is not about the chemistry of saltwater rust. It is about what happens when responsible waste diversion is expensive and hiding our industrial footprints under the waves is effortless. The greatest environmental hazard we face is not simply failing to remediate past errors, but building an economic structure where profiting from the wreckage becomes far more rewarding than preventing the disaster in the first place.